Who's ready to start? Connie's ready. Gable's ready. Everybody else ready? All right. Larry, who we got online tonight?
We've got about 4 joining us, 3.
Okay, all right, as is normal. We have an audience here and an audience right there. Thank you for everybody for coming and tuning in as well. We are in Daniel chapter 5 tonight. Daniel chapter 5. You've got your handouts with you. You've got the chapter in your hands as well as some notes to maybe make in the margins, and take those and use those as you would. They'll also guide us in our conversations tonight. In looking at chapter 5, we're going to see a kind of a turning point with this chapter. Who has been the major individual interacting with Daniel up through chapter 4?
Nebuchadnezzar.
Nebuchadnezzar. And what has God been doing with Daniel and Nebuchadnezzar through the first 4 chapters? How would you define God's purpose with these two men? I don't have a set answer for that written down anywhere. So, what do you think? What's God trying to do here?
God communicating himself and his character to Nebuchadnezzar, perhaps.
Okay, he's trying to get Nebuchadnezzar to understand who he is. I think that's a definite major theme in the first 4 chapters. What else comes to mind when you think about this triad of God, Daniel, and Nebuchadnezzar?
Well, it shows, one thing it shows Daniel's faith, and his obedience
Okay, Daniel's obedience to who?
to God.
To God. How does Daniel show, though, his obedience to Nebuchadnezzar, his king? Is he in rebellion to Nebuchadnezzar?
He shows it by
Larry?
He shows concern for Nebuchadnezzar, even when interpreting the dreams. He goes, "Hey, you can still fix this." He's trying to suggest some things. And Nebuchadnezzar knew that Daniel had him in interest, but he also knew he put God first. And Nebuchadnezzar had no chance of changing that. But that's exactly what we would do with somebody today that's not a Christian. We want to show concern for them, but we're not going to compromise our service to God.
And when Nebuchadnezzar interacted with God, okay, a couple of definite times, right? The fiery furnace with Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And then with the original dream in chapter 2 with Daniel. And then last week's dream about the tree and the stump and all of that. Nebuchadnezzar makes some statements about Jehovah, doesn't he? What does he say about Jehovah God? What's his overall attitude toward Jehovah?
He is the Lord High God. He's the
He
one that
uses
does things.
phrases that we would be very happy to have heard from the nation of Israel if they had worshiped God in the way Nebuchadnezzar proclaims, right? He makes some pretty strong statements concerning the nature of Jehovah. And who does he always couple that with? But kind of back to Larry's point a little bit here. Who does he always connect that with? In Nebuchadnezzar's mind,
It's Daniel's God.
this is Daniel's God. Now, let me ask you something. People that know you and interact with you in relationships, do they look at you and see Jehovah is your God? When they think of me, do they think Martin? He is a worshiper of Jehovah. How would they know that? How would I get that response from people?
Well, the way to live your life.
How you live your life?
And, your profession, how you profess it. You're a child of God, and you believe in
How did Daniel in front of Nebuchadnezzar express his relationship with God? How did he reflect how he thought about God to Nebuchadnezzar? Because it had impact on Nebuchadnezzar.
He would never elevate himself above God. He would always give God credit for the interpretation.
God is more powerful than me. The interpretation you're receiving is not from me. It's from Jehovah God. And there are several instances through these first chapters where the relationship between Daniel and God, Daniel just doesn't have this vertical relationship and keep it in his pocket. He has this vertical relationship with God, and he is sharing that in this role with Nebuchadnezzar that he's been placed in. And I think that's a very important lesson for us to think about and to learn from. Who is ultimately the recipient of the book of Daniel, and as the recipient of the book, the lessons that we find such as this in this book? Who is supposed to be learning from this relationship between Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar, and Jehovah, besides those two guys?
The captives.
The rest of the captives, the nation of Israel, who is right there with Daniel over there in captivity. They're seeing this play out among themselves across a couple of generations. Grandpa, son, and grandson. That age gap, range of years, as we would think about it, is about as long as they were in captivity. Grandpa went into captivity. The son was raised in captivity, and either he went home as an older man, and in a very few cases, grandpa got to go back as part of the remnant, or the third generation was born in captivity and went back as a young person, never having seen Jerusalem or the promised land before. So that's the three situations you've got within this span of captives. This cross-generational thing is going on. Now, does the cross-generational thing occur, and it's important for us to think about in chapter 5 tonight? Yeah, because Nebuchadnezzar is not the king in chapter 5. His son is. And actually, he's called his son, but in reality, more than likely, he's his grandson. Okay? And so the time, not only are the times and the years clicking by for Daniel, they're clicking by for the empire, all the captives, and even the kingship is changing hands as this empire moves through God's timeline. All right. And so when we get into chapter 4 now, or did last week, Nebuchadnezzar receives this ultimate lesson in humility, didn't he? And we said, what was our title for last week's lesson for chapter 4? God is the humbler of the proud, isn't he? And Nebuchadnezzar had to receive that lesson. And how did Nebuchadnezzar receive that lesson? How was Nebuchadnezzar humbled?
He had to live like an animal.
Yeah, this great king of Babylon, greatest king on earth at this time, creator of the Hanging Gardens of Babylon, one of the greatest wonders of the ancient world. And while he was out walking on the wall one night, after he'd received that interpretation of his dream a year before, he starts praising himself and patting himself on the back and looking at this grandeur that he has created among his city that he is in charge of. And he elevates himself, doesn't he, in his mind. And what speaks? An angel speaks. A voice from heaven, an angel comes and says, "You're falling." And so a voice fell and a king fell. And he is humbled as eating as an animal, living as an animal for a period of time. And you know what? The kingdom got along just fine without him during that period of time. And that may have been more humbling for his ego than having the physical thing happen to him, because he wasn't needed. He wasn't indispensable for the Babylonian Empire. God can manage that empire if he chose to anyway, and through anybody he wanted to. And so Nebuchadnezzar learns that lesson. Now, why is that important when we get over to chapter 5? Well, we're going to see. So let's turn over and read the first 4 verses. Who'll read verses 1 through 4 for us in chapter 5? Gable, would you read that for us?
Yes, sir.
1 through 4.
All right. Belshazzar the king made a great feast for 1,000 of his lords and drank wine in the presence of the 1,000. While he tasted the wine, Belshazzar gave the command to bring the gold and silver vessels which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken from the temple, which had been in Jerusalem, that the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines might drink from them. Then they brought the gold vessels that had been taken from the temple of the house of God, which had been in Jerusalem. And the king and his lords, his wives, and his concubines drank from them. They drank wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, bronze and iron, wood and stone.
All right. Here we're introduced to this chapter's character, Belshazzar, not Belteshazzar. That's Daniel's Babylonian name. So we got Belshazzar and Belteshazzar in this chapter. And we have a mention of Nebuchadnezzar. But who did not learn the lesson that their father learned? Belshazzar or Belshazzar. He evidently didn't learn the lesson that Nebuchadnezzar had learned concerning Jehovah, who he was, and that he was the humbler of the proud. When we look at who Belshazzar was, he began his reign in 553 BC. We know this from outside sources. He continued in his reign until the fall of Babylon to Cyrus the Great. And it's interesting, we know the date that happened. Ancient records reflect that the fall of Babylon to Cyrus the Great occurred on October the 12th, 539 BC. I don't have a time. I do have a date. So until October the 12th, 539 BC. So when was the handwriting on the wall? This is one of the rare cases where you can put a date in the margin of your Bible. October the 12th or October the 11th, 539 BC. In the evening, we have what was in Daniel chapter 5. That's amazing to me that we have that accuracy available to us in some cases. And he apparently shared his reign with Nabonidus, and that's the name of his father, okay, and as co-regent. And so that somewhat explains verse 2 when it says that Nebuchadnezzar was his father. We got 3 possible solutions. The term father and son's often used to mean successor, and that rather than an immediate descendant in a bloodline. And it may be Nabonidus, recorded in inscriptions as his father, may have married Nebuchadnezzar's widow, which would then make him Nebuchadnezzar's son through the queen mother. Okay. Or it could be that Nabonidus married a daughter of Nebuchadnezzar, making Nebuchadnezzar his grandson, and that the idea of being the son of Nebuchadnezzar, and I tend to think this is the way it was, in the sense that he's mentioning Nebuchadnezzar. Why does Belshazzar need his name attached as the son of Nebuchadnezzar? What does that do for Belshazzar? Who is the greatest king in the Babylonian Empire? Nebuchadnezzar. Who conquered these other nations, including Israel? Nebuchadnezzar. If you're going to hitch your wagon to the political or the politician, okay, who succeeded you, who was highly popular, and you don't have a firm grip on the political power that he had, what do you try to do? Make yourself look like the heir apparent or the approved successor of, right? You see that a lot in corporations. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. If a CEO of a famous company, maybe the founder of the company, what is often the case? think of Ford Motor Company. That's a good one to go back a few years on. When Henry Ford died, who took over Ford? They named a car after him,
Edsel.
Edsel Ford. Okay, and I believe that's right. And so it was passed down. But what was his problem? He wasn't Henry. Henry was a genius. Edsel was the son of a genius. Belshazzar is the son of a great king who had a relationship and understanding of Jehovah. Belshazzar was pagan. And so we see a little bit, that's just a little background of who this Belshazzar was. More than likely, I think he's probably his grandson. But this connection to Nebuchadnezzar is a reach back to try to put this cloak of royalty upon him and strengthen his position. Because it talks about him in this chapter being king of the Chaldeans. Now, who are the Chaldeans? We've seen them before.
Wise men.
The Chaldeans, the soothsayers, the magicians, and the wise men. So Belshazzar had surrounded himself with them, and he's the king of the Chaldeans. So maybe that's the faction that is in support of him, or perhaps pulling his strings, and he's more of a puppet than a true king. Okay. Verses 2 and 3, we see that the king might drink therefrom out of these vessels that came from the temple in Jerusalem. Now, why take the temple vessels from Jerusalem and drink from them with all your friends while you're having this drinking party? They conquered a lot of countries. Why take Israel's vessels?
To humiliate, quote unquote, his God in front of the people, in front of the captains.
Okay. Who
Near his name.
Who is the owner of those vessels?
God.
Jehovah. And Jehovah, according to Nebuchadnezzar, was who? The God of who? Daniel. Who is Belshazzar the king of? It says in chapter 5. The Chaldeans. Oh, we haven't seen any conflict already, have we, between the Chaldeans and Daniel, have we? You see the setup here? Belshazzar's playing to his support. And these guys are enjoying this because now they're drinking out of the vessels dedicated to Jehovah, the God of Daniel, and they're just boozing it up in these vessels that have been dedicated to God. And they have taken them out and made them common. What happens to things that were supposed to be that were dedicated to God? Do you get to just use them any willy-nilly way you wanted to? I mean, what are some of the items that were dedicated to God that we know of? Besides these vessels in the temple. How about Eli? Did Hannah not dedicate him to God? I'm sorry, not Eli. Samuel and Hannah. Did she not dedicate her son to God? And what did Hannah have to do because of that?
Give him up.
Give him up. And he served Eli, didn't he? In the tabernacle. Right?
And
What else?
also, while he wants to be connected to Nebuchadnezzar, sometimes of another generation, I really know more than that past generation. And he's kind of, he was kind of worried about the God of the Israelites. Hey, man, I'm stronger than my grandfather. I don't have to worry about this. We're going to even be greater.
He's making a statement, isn't he?
Making his own path.
I don't need to bow the way Nebuchadnezzar did. And perhaps Nebuchadnezzar's name is attached to him, so I'm great. I'm as great as him. I'm his son or grandson.
He's more than
But yet,
likely.
I am greater than Jehovah, who Nebuchadnezzar was humbled by. Look at us. Let's get out the dishes devoted to Jehovah and really than them. And so what does that do to Belshazzar in relationship with Jehovah then? He's not recognizing that Jehovah is over all. He is saying, I am over Jehovah. And all those from Palestine who serve that God. Okay? And so there we have it. That's what's going on here. And so he is demonstrating then his access to Nebuchadnezzar's treasures. That's another way to prove that I am his chosen replacement. I've got access to his treasury, don't I? Who took these from the temple? Nebuchadnezzar did. But who goes and gets them out of his temple to Baal and brings them to his party? Belshazzar does. So by showing that I've got access to all of Nebuchadnezzar's things, by extension, that means I'm his replacement. And so we see that. And he demonstrates his generosity by sharing their use with his fellow partiers. And then in verse 4, it says he praised the gods of gold. What fools these people were for praising and worshiping parts of creation instead of the Creator. But are many today any different? Really? What about us? Do we trip up sometimes and worship gods of gold? Maybe not exactly as these fellas are doing it, but we need to be careful with that. All right, just some thoughts in verses 1 through 4. Let's look at, somebody read verses 5 and 6. Something's going to happen here.
In the same hour came forth fingers of a man's hand, and wrote over against the candlestick upon the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the part of the hand that wrote. And the king's countenance was changed, and his thoughts troubled him, so that the joints of his loins were loose, and his knees smote one against the other. The king cried aloud to bring in the astrologers, the Chaldeans, and the soothsayers. And the king spake and said to the wise men of Babylon, whosoever shall read this writing and show me the interpretation thereof shall be clothed with scarlet and have a chain of gold about his neck, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Then came in all the king's wise men. They could not read the writing, nor make known to the king the interpretation thereof.
Wow, it's almost, some of this sounds so familiar, doesn't it? But verses 5 and 6, this great king, in quotes, great king, who is so powerful that he had access to all of Nebuchadnezzar's treasures that he had stolen. And it was showing that he was more powerful than Jehovah by taking the dedicated vessels to Jehovah and using them for his common feast. He sees merely the fingers of a hand writing on the wall. And it says, what? The fingers of a hand wrote, and the king saw. And verses 5 and 6, and his knees smote one another. Where is this courage of this great king now? You know, it's one thing to talk a good game in sports, but at some point, what do you have to do with all that trash talk?
Back it up.
At some point, you got to back it up. And through the events, it becomes very clear very quickly that this is no hero for the Babylonians to follow. Here he is. One moment he's beating his chest, and the next he's beating his knees together. And he's only seen the hand of God. He hasn't even seen all of God. Okay, in this imagery. Larry?
Whenever anyone in the Bible comes into the presence of God, you see this reaction. It's like, it's just when finally you get all this garbage in your mind out of the way and you see who God is and who you are. It's sad when you had not prepared yourself.
How does this compare to Nebuchadnezzar? Here's one moment Nebuchadnezzar is boasting about himself walking on the wall. In the next verse, he's braying in the backyard like a donkey. Here's his son bragging and boasting to his partiers. And the next moment, he can't keep his knees from banging together. He's so scared. And it even says his joints were loosed. Well, that means two things. Number one, he probably couldn't stand up. And the other thing is he couldn't hold himself in anymore. And we all know that sometimes you can get so scared that that happens, right? And so he's not able to control himself. He's so scared. Such a small manifestation of God's mighty power. And look at its effect on this fellow. And what does he say in verse 7? Bring in the enchanters or the soothsayers and the Chaldeans. Bring them all in, and I'll give them a third of the kingdom and put purple on them. And so he cries aloud to bring in the enchanters, and that happens. And then it says in verse 8, then in came all the king's wise men. Does this not sound familiar to chapter 2? He's falling into the same empty avenues that Nebuchadnezzar did. It says in verse 9, King Belshazzar was greatly troubled, his countenance was changed in him, and his lords were perplexed. And then there's an interesting phrase in the beginning of verse 10. The beginning of verse 10 says, now the queen. You know, there's nothing that can throw cold water on a good party than have one of the parents show up. Is that not what's going on here? These boys are having a rowdy good time. And now we got a problem. And now mom comes in verse 10. It says, now the queen. What did the queen remember that evidently Belshazzar has forgotten? There's a man in your kingdom who can answer this because he answered your father's dreams and visions. And his name is what? Daniel. And you can almost imagine the groans that come out of the Chaldeans and the lords in this crowd when mom comes in and says, call in Daniel. Bring old Daniel out of retirement. And Daniel's getting older by this point. Okay? And she's calling him in and making his name known. There is a man in thy kingdom, verse 11, in whom is the spirit of the holy gods. And in the days of thy father, light and understanding and wisdom, like the wisdom of gods, was found in him. And King Nebuchadnezzar, thy father, the king, emphasis, the real king, I say, thy father made him master of the magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. Now, who's in the room? The magicians, enchanters, Chaldeans, and soothsayers. And the queen says, their master is Daniel. Now let, verse 12, Daniel be called, and he will show the interpretation. I don't know exactly who this queen was by name, but I'll tell you one thing. She had a good memory. And she watched her husband, Nebuchadnezzar, go through what he went through, and she believed. And she remembers. And so Daniel's brought in verse 13. And so what then is the result? Daniel, verse 13, is brought in before the king, and the king spake unto Daniel, art thou Daniel, and who art of the children of the captivity of Judah, whom the king my father brought out of Judah? Okay, that tells you everything you need to know right there. Did Belshazzar know who Daniel was? He almost gave him his home address in Israel. He knew exactly who Daniel was. Are you Daniel? Maybe he's never met him in person before. I don't know. But the fame of Daniel was known. I have heard of thee, that the spirit of gods is in thee, and the light of understanding and excellent wisdom are found in thee. Boy, Belshazzar, you're a real genius. Who just told you that? Your mother. And now he's claiming it as his own wisdom. I've never seen anybody ever do that before. Larry?
But could you imagine? They identified Daniel with the captives. They identified the spirit of God is in him and what's on the table from their drinking. They may be hearing this and they can look. If it's
Mhm.
kind of some visual reminders, here's what we've done.
That's right.
And now we're acknowledging something like.
Children of Judah who are in captivity, and my father has brought you out of Judah, and they're surrounded by the dishes out of the temple of Judah. Interesting, isn't it? All right. So then he tells Daniel, I've heard of you, and if you'll tell me interpretation of this, what we're seeing here, you'll be clothed in purple, you'll have a chain of gold put around your neck, woohoo, and shall be the third ruler in the kingdom. Now, what does Daniel know already as understanding in this interpretation? What is Belshazzar offering Daniel?
See, don't type in.
Hey, I'll trade you $100 bill of US currency for $100 bill of Confederate currency. Right? And it's 1865 when I make that offer. Richmond's almost ready to fall. And I got a pocket full of Confederate money. Anybody ready to change out and give me gold eagles for that? What's the problem with that offer? It's worthless. It's worthless. Right? Because in a mere matter of hours from this point, is Belshazzar going to be in any position at all to give Daniel purple or a chain of gold or make him third in a kingdom that's about ready to be overthrown? I mean, who wants to take over Germany in 1945 when the Soviet army is at the gates of Berlin, right? Who's going to take over for Hitler? Nobody wanted that job at that time. Who wants to be the king of Babylon after Belshazzar? Nobody. It's worthless. So what he's offering here is not worth much. Of course, he thinks it is in his inflated idea. And so how does Daniel respond in verse 17 through the about verse 24? Look at verse 17. Daniel, I want to make this point. In verse 17, we see Daniel respond to Belshazzar, and he never once spoke to Nebuchadnezzar this way. Daniel never spoke disdainfully toward Nebuchadnezzar in any of their interactions. How does he speak to Belshazzar? Let thy gifts be to thyself, and give thy rewards to another. Talk about the motion by Daniel, let thy rewards be to another. Because Daniel knows. Nevertheless, I will read the writing unto the king and make known to him the interpretation. And so he talks to him in verse 18, O thou king, the most high God, he's about ready to give him a lesson here, gave Nebuchadnezzar thy father the kingdom and greatness and glory and majesty, and because of the greatness that Jehovah God gave him, all the peoples, nations, language trembled and feared before him. Whom he would, he slew. Whom he would, he kept alive. Whom he would raise up, and whom he would put down. And when his heart was lifted up, and his spirit was hardened so that he dealt proudly, he was just deposed from his kingly throne, and they took the glory from him. He was driven from the sons of men, and his heart was made like the beast. He dwelled among the wild asses. He ate grass like oxen. His body was wet with the dew of heaven, until he knew the Most High God ruled the kingdom of men, and he set it up over it whosoever he will. And thou, verse 22, his son, O Belshazzar, hast not humbled thy heart, though thou knewest all this. Don't play stupid with me. You knew this, and you knew exactly what you were doing when you took these vessels and brought them into this party and profaned God. He didn't even say you profaned my God. You profaned the most high God by doing this. You brought the vessels of his house before thee, thy lords, thy wives, thy concubines. You have drunk wine from them, and thou hast praised the gods of silver and gold, brass, iron, wood, and stone, which see not, nor hear, nor know, and the God in whose hand thy breath is, and whose are all thy ways, hast thou not glorified. Man, you know, sometimes preachers have to bring it. This is one of those sermons. Daniel's bringing it to Belshazzar. He's not pulling any punches. Then was the part of the hand set from before him, and this writing was inscribed. Mene, mene, tekel upharsin. I don't know exactly what language this was written in on the wall by the hand. I tend to think it was probably written in Hebrew, which they would not necessarily have known how to read. Maybe it was written in a language only Daniel, through interpretation, and the Holy Spirit would be able to read to him and use. But this is what that says in Hebrew. Mene, mene, tekel upharsin. And what does that mean? After hearing Daniel's sermon just now, it can't be good, can it? What does it mean? You are weighed in the balances. Your weight, I think, is actually the way it technically would read. Your weight is weighed. Mene, mene. Your weight is weighed. And what's the problem with Belshazzar's weight? It is found wanting. It is not enough. Now, whose scales is Nebuchadnezzar on? Man's? He's on God's scales, the only one that matters. Now, that's an important thing, really, and a good thing. You want to be caught and measured by man's scales? Not me, because God is holy and God is just. That tells me that God's scales don't cheat. They're in sync. They measure accurately every single time. And Belshazzar is measured and weighed on the scales of God, and he is found wanting. And he says to him also that this very night the kingdom would be torn apart and taken from him. Belshazzar, you're too light for the job. And God, who can put anybody in charge of any kingdom he wants to, this very night is going to take your kingdom and give it to others. Look at verse 29. Then commanded Belshazzar, after all this is said, then they clothed Daniel with purple and put a chain of gold about his neck and made proclamation concerning him that he should be the third ruler of the kingdom. So in verse 28, the kingdom is divided and it's given to the Medes and the Persians. And yet now Belshazzar, who is knowing of a certainty what this interpretation is, who does he then put in charge of the kingdom? Tell you what, Daniel, here's the robes, here's the gold chain, you got it, and they run. Third man in the kingdom, put in charge. Verse 30, how far was Belshazzar able to run? The Chaldean king, it says. In that night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, not the Babylonian king, the Chaldean king was what? Was slain. And Darius the Mede received the kingdom, being about 62 years old. Another young man. Who was left in charge that night? in this transition of administrations. Daniel. Daniel. They're weighed in the balances of God. Verse 29. Oh, great. Third in the empire. Daniel you can just see it. Daniel's going, you got robes on me. You put this chain of gold around me, signifying authority in the kingdom. And I'm standing here waiting for the Medes and the Persians to come in. So much for my quiet retirement, right? He's forced back into office again. And that closes out the curtain on Babylon. But God's captivity for Israel and his trial is not over, because now a new kingdom with a new ruler must be faced. And who has to learn the lessons in chapter 1 through 5 all over again? The Medes and the Persians. Cyrus has to be taught these lessons. It's an interesting segue chapter, right? It's almost a bridge between these two kingdoms. Now, remember, just a minute. Remember now in Daniel chapter 2, we had a statue, didn't we? And in that statue, you had one kingdom, Nebuchadnezzar's, was gold, right? But who was the second kingdom?
Persians.
The Medes and the Persians. We are moving from in that statue through time. We are now moving from that first one into that second kingdom. Now remember who is going to come during the time of the rulers of the fourth kingdom. Folks, we're already into the second kingdom here in chapter 5. So God's plan marches on, and he is putting it in place. And with this change of administration becomes a change of the government. Not only just in leadership, but the Persians ruled differently than the Babylonians did. Okay, Persian law was very different than Babylonian law. The basis of Western law comes originally from Persia. The edicts of Cyrus and Xerxes were heavily leaned upon to create the Magna Carta and many other documents in Western civilization that ultimately brings about what we have today. And so it's interesting to look at with that what all is occurring here. Joni had a comment.
Just had a question. I just realized that Jeconiah or Jehoiachin is somewhere in here. He's released by this evil Merodach, who was the son of Nebuchadnezzar.
Yep.
And he even eats with the king. And this son is not king for very long, just a couple of years. So that, Jehoiachin could have died, but in a couple of years, maybe not. But it makes me wonder, Daniel's being used by God here, but there are other captives of great importance and knowledge probably that are in this kingdom. And I just wonder, where is he? Do you know where he is and what's happened to him?
No, we don't. There's no other passages other than what we have there in 2 Kings, and I guess is where
Jeremiah.
Yeah, and that's right. Jeremiah has some references to him as well. And there is more going on here. I mean, this book of Daniel's is emphasizing the lessons that Israel had to learn in the captivity. It's not meant to be this end-all chronology or history book, although we've got great history here. There's other references that talk about these other rulers, but the point I would say to that is he was irrelevant. It didn't matter what happened to the Judah king, because he was carried away in captivity and he was slain. And I would even challenge
Well, he's in the line of David, and so he's, it's a preservation of the line for Christ to come through.
was Jehoiakim in the line of Jesus Christ? Okay. He's direct descendant. It's in Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew. Okay.
As Coniah, I mean, he's referred to as Coniah.
Oh, Coniah. Yeah. So I get that. But him as his role as king didn't matter. It was just the seed. I mean, God could raise up children of Abraham from these stones, right? God chose who he chose out of the children of the seed of David to bring Jesus Christ to
It just makes me
fruition.
wonder, where is he when all this is going on?
We don't know.
Does
We
Daniel
don't
have
know.
any contact with him?
My guess is this happened late enough. He's been dead for probably 30 years. I think he's been dead a long time,
Well, he was alive.
possibly even before,
was alive in 566.
possibly before Belshazzar's birth. Belshazzar is the grandson of Nebuchadnezzar, not his actual son. And that's what I tend to think, that he is actually the physical son of Nabonidus, who replaced Nebuchadnezzar. Okay?
Quick thought. Normally, Daniel would have been killed, been part of leadership, but what did Daniel just do with Belshazzar publicly? It basically said, Medes and Persians taken over. He was not a yes man. Also, you combine that with the dream with Nebuchadnezzar. Well, this was predicted, our kingdom coming. And then with Daniel, not Daniel, but Isaiah literally naming, I've heard all of those things kind of made them realize this guy's not just a ruler. This guy's been independent. Could you imagine talking to the people that are at that feast that night? And how here Daniel stood up and dressed out the king before all of the rulers and said, Medes and Persians taken over. That has to, that's very interesting of how that's, he basically was given a seat on the Titanic, but
Yeah,
but he had a lifeboat because of his integrity and his service to God.
I agree. We're going to see. It's the other thought that I have about all that is, did the Medes and Persians know who Daniel was? That I've thought about that too. With all the way we've seen already of this prophet and these visions at the highest levels of royalty interacting through the years, how well was Daniel's fame known a little further out, okay, a little more broadly. And of course, in concert with that, as his fame went, so would the knowledge and fame of Jehovah God go with the name of Daniel. Right? And that's an interesting thing to maybe ponder as well. Maybe some good lessons from that. Okay. Good thoughts. I think Daniel 5 is like I said, it's a bridging point. The last chapter we get with Daniel as kind of a narrative is going to be next week, chapter 6. And then we're going to get into a very different part of the book. In Daniel 6, we're going to see not only is God a humbler of the proud, he is an avenger of his honor in this chapter, because he certainly took exception with Belshazzar using those vessels, didn't he? It says, and Daniel, that's what Daniel says brought about what happens to Belshazzar, is what he did with the vessels of God. We need to be careful how we handle the vessels of God, don't we? But then in chapter 6, next week, we're going to see that he is Lord of Lions. Because we're going to have that famous story we've all heard and known since childhood of Daniel and the lion's den. But that's going to happen under the Persian Empire, isn't it? John?
Is it true that we do not know what language this Mene Tekel Parson is in?
I don't know that 100% why. Why do you ask?
Because I read that we don't know what language that is.
I don't think we know for sure. What I have on the board here is Hebrew that says that. It doesn't say it was a language that no one knew. It was just that the Chaldeans, soothsayers, magicians, and those that were present, they could not read it and provide interpretation. So either it was a language, heavenly language that only Daniel would know through inspiration, or whether it was one that he would know because he was Hebrew and he was the only Hebrew in the room. I don't know. Doesn't say. We do know Daniel was able to read it and nobody else could. So, Anyway, I just thought it was interesting. I found that and I was like, wow, that's what it says. That's how it reads in the Hebrew text. In there, and so I thought I would share that, but we don't know that for sure. Whether that was a miraculous reading, it was certainly a miraculous interpretation. Okay, anything else? Okay, next week, chapter 6, we're gonna see lions, we're gonna see an old man, he gets thrown in. The king is upset, he gets trapped by his own words, we've seen that before, under the Babylonians. Cyrus is no exception, he's gonna get trapped by his own walls, just like Nebuchadnezzar did with the fiery furnace. And let's see how Daniel stands up to his big test of his lifetime. His friends have already gone through the fire, literally. Now Daniel's going to be thrown into his fire. We'll see how he responds. And the setup for that is just as interesting and important as the setup of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what they said to Nebuchadnezzar on the plains of Shinar about what they will do and whether we're saved or not is in God's hands. Right? Okay. Let's read chapter 6 and you'll be ready for next week. Thank you for your attention.